In the reading rooms of the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Library of Congress, a peculiar pattern emerges when examining atlases, encyclopedias, and geographical texts published between 1700 and 1850. Maps show a vast territory across Central Asia labeled Tartaria or Tartary, sometimes Grande Tartari, Tartaria Magna, or Independent Tartary. The region appears prominently, spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to the borders of China and Persia. Yet by 1900, the name had virtually disappeared from official maps and geographical discourse. This documentary examines a historical question implied by our title. Was there indeed a last generation that remembered Tartaria as a living geographical and cultural reality? And if so, who were they, what did they remember, and why did that memory fade so completely? The question is not whether a conspiracy erased Tartaria from history. The question is narrower and more precise. When did the term stop being used in everyday geographical reference? Who were the last people to use it meaningfully, and what historical processes explain its disappearance? To answer this, we must first establish what Tartaria actually meant to the people who used the term. The term Tartary derives from Tatar, a name applied by European writers to various Turkic and Mongol peoples of Central Asia beginning in the medieval period. Historical records indicate that Western Europeans, lacking detailed knowledge of the vast interior of Asia, used Tartary as a catch-all geographical designation for lands beyond the familiar borders of Russia, Persia, and China. The Encyclopaedia Britannica 1771 edition contains a lengthy entry on Tartary, describing it not as a unified empire, but as a region inhabited by various nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. The entry distinguishes between several Tartaries: Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Tibetan Tartary. This nomenclature reflected European attempts to organize information about a region they understood imperfectly. Documentation from the 17th and 18th centuries reveals that Tartaria was primarily a European cartographic convention. Russian administrative records from the same period do not use Tartaria to describe their eastern territories. They refer instead to specific khanates, tribal regions, and administrative units. The Khanate of Sibir, the Dzungar Khanate, the territories of the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other named peoples. Chinese sources similarly do not reference a place called Tartaria. Ming and Qing dynasty documents refer to specific peoples: Mongols, Manchus, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others, each with their own territories and political structures. This raises our first significant question: if the people who lived in Tartaria did not call their homeland by that name, and if the major powers that bordered or controlled these territories did not use the term in their administrative records, then Tartaria existed primarily as a European conceptual framework, a name imposed from outside to organize unfamiliar geography. Who, then, would constitute the last generation that remembered Tartaria? Not the inhabitants of the region itself, but rather the Europeans and Americans who used the term in maps, books, and educated discourse. Examining the publication dates of major atlases and geographical works reveals a clear pattern for the term's usage. During the period from 1600 to 1750, Tartary, or Tartaria, appears on virtually every major European map depicting Asia. The 1570 Ortelius Atlas, the 1662 Blau Atlas, and the maps of Guillaume de Lisle in the early 1700s all prominently feature Tartary as a major geographical division. Encyclopedia entries describe Tartary's geography, climate, and peoples, though often with significant inaccuracies reflecting limited European knowledge. As European and Russian exploration of Central Asia intensified between 1750 and 1850, cartographers began replacing the general term, Tartary, with more specific designations. The 1800 Pinkerton Atlas shows this transition clearly, while independent Tartary still appears. It's now subdivided into named khanates and tribal territories, Khiva, Bokhara, Kokand, territories of the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. By mid-century, major reference works began to phase out Tartary entirely. The 1878 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica's entry on Tartary includes this telling passage. The name Tartary is now little used, and is indeed almost obsolete. The countries formerly grouped under this general name are now known by their proper designations. In atlases and geographical texts published after 1900, Tartary appears primarily in historical contexts or in references to older maps. The term has become an artifact of cartographic history rather than a living geographical designation. This pattern suggests that the last generation that remembered Tartaria would have been born roughly between 1820 and 1850, people whose education included older geographical frameworks, but who lived to see those frameworks replaced by more accurate, detailed knowledge. To understand who comprised this last generation, we must examine the documentary record of who continued using Tartary, even as the term fell out of favor. University curricula and textbooks show continued use of Tartary into the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in secondary education. A geography textbook published in Boston in 1875, Mitchell's School Geography, still includes Tartary as a regional designation, though with qualifications about its imprecision. Personal letters and diaries from travelers to Central Asia during this period reveal a transitional vocabulary. British diplomatic correspondence from the 1860s regarding the Great Game rivalry with Russia in Central Asia sometimes uses Tartary in informal contexts but employs specific place names, Bokhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, in official reports. Literary works provide evidence of changing usage. In the 1840s and 1850s, European novels occasionally referenced Tartary as an exotic, distant land. By the 1880s and 1890s, such references become period markers. Authors use Tartary only when depicting earlier historical periods or when characterizing older, less educated characters. Immigration records from this period occasionally list individuals' origins as Tartary or Russian Tartary. These entries, made by immigration officials rather than the immigrants themselves, reflect the officials' geographical education rather than the self-identification of the immigrants, who typically identified by more specific ethnic or regional affiliations. Census records from the Russian Empire during the same period never use Tartary as an administrative category. They list specific gubernias, oblasts, and ethnic classifications. This documentation suggests that the last generation to remember Tartaria were not inhabitants of the region, but rather Europeans and Americans whose geographical education predated the era of precise cartography and ethnography. A critical gap in the historical record demands attention. We have virtually no documentation of people from the region itself claiming Tartarian identity or expressing a memory of Tartaria as a lost homeland or political entity. The absence is striking because the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of numerous nationalist and cultural revival movements across Central Asia. Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and other intellectuals wrote extensively about their people's histories, often reaching back centuries to construct national narratives. Yet none of these movements reference Tartaria as a historical state or civilization that their peoples once belonged to. Russian ethnographic studies from the 1850s through the 1890s, conducted by researchers who interviewed thousands of Central Asians about their history, culture, and self-understanding, contain no reports of informants identifying as Tartarian or describing their ancestors as having belonged to a Tartarian civilization. This silence is historically significant. It suggests that Tartaria was never an endogenous identity, never a name that the region's inhabitants used for themselves or their political formations. Instead, it existed solely as an exogenous label, a European filing system for organizing information about lands they had not yet thoroughly explored. If there was a last generation that remembered Tartaria, then their memory was of a geographical concept, not of a lived cultural or political reality. To understand how Tartaria disappeared from maps and discourse, we must examine the broader transformation of geographical knowledge in the 19th century. The 1800s witnessed an explosion of systematic geographical exploration. Russian military expeditions into Central Asia, British surveys of India's northern frontiers, and scientific expeditions sponsored by European geographical societies generated unprecedented volumes of detailed, specific information about regions previously known only through travelers' tales and second-hand reports. As this information entered the cartographic mainstream, the broad, vague regional designations of earlier centuries became obsolete. Why label a region independent Tartary when you could now accurately delineate the Khanate of Khiva, the Emirate of Bokhara, and the territories of specific tribal confederations? The professionalization of geography as an academic discipline accelerated this process. The founding of major geographical societies, the Société de Géographie in Paris in 1821, the Royal Geographical Society in London in 1830, the American Geographical Society in 1851, created institutional structures that value precision, standardization, and empirical verification over traditional nomenclature. Cartographic standards changed accordingly. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85, primarily concerned with the colonial partition of Africa, also established conventions for geographical naming that influenced mapmaking worldwide. Vague regional terms gave way to precise boundaries, named political entities, and standardized transliterations of local place names. This transformation was not unique to Tartaria. Other broad geographical terms fell into disuse during the same period. Hindustan and the Indies became more precisely defined as India, the East Indies, and the West Indies. Abyssinia gradually gave way to Ethiopia. Persia would eventually be replaced by Iran. The difference is that most of these other terms had some connection to endogenous names or political entities. Tartaria, by contrast, had always been entirely a European invention with no corresponding self-identification among the region's inhabitants. But the transformation of geographical knowledge alone does not fully explain the completeness of Tartaria's disappearance. Other obsolete geographical terms persist in cultural memory, in literature, and historical discussions. We still speak of the Levant, Cathay, the Orient, all imprecise, Eurocentric terms that nevertheless retain some currency in historical and cultural contexts. Why did Tartaria vanish so completely that by the late 20th century, most educated people had never heard the term? Part of the answer lies in the geopolitical transformation of Central Asia during the period when Tartaria was fading from maps. The Russian conquest of Central Asia, which intensified dramatically in the 1860s and 1870s, fundamentally restructured the region's political geography. Between 1865 and 1885, the Russian Empire conquered or established protectorates over the major Central Asian Khanates and Emirates: Tashkent in 1865, Bokhara in 1868, Khiva in 1873, the Turkmen territories by 1881, the Pamir region by 1895. This conquest coincided almost exactly with the period when Tartaria was disappearing from European maps. The timing is significant. As the region came under Russian administrative control, it was simultaneously being reorganized into new territorial units with new names: the Governor-Generalship of Turkestan, the Sirdarya Oblast, the Samarkand Oblast, and so on. For European cartographers and geographers, there was no longer any need for a vague term like Tartaria to describe a poorly understood region. The territory was now part of the Russian Empire, with clearly defined administrative divisions and established place names. The integration of Central Asia into the Russian Empire also meant that information about the region increasingly came through Russian channels. Using Russian geographical terminology, European geographical societies, newspapers, and publishers relied heavily on Russian sources for information about Central Asia. Those Russian sources, as noted earlier, had never used Tartaria in the first place. This raises an important question: was the disappearance of Tartaria from Western geographical discourse partly a function of Western Europe's deference to Russian authority over the region? British sources from the era of the Great Game suggest some resistance to this linguistic imperialism. British Indian surveys and military intelligence reports sometimes continued using older geographical terms or developed their own nomenclature for Central Asian territories. But by the 1890s, with the Anglo-Russian border agreements defining spheres of influence, even British sources largely adopted Russian geographical terminology for the region. The generation that remembered Tartaria, then, was also the generation that witnessed the final incorporation of Central Asia into the European-dominated world system, not as a mysterious, semi-mythical region beyond the edge of the known world, but as a clearly defined colonial possession of the Russian Empire. We must also consider the role of education in determining what geographical knowledge is transmitted across generations. The late 19th century saw massive reforms in education systems across Europe and North America. Geography became a standardized school subject, with approved textbooks, official curricula, and examinations. These systems had a strong normalizing effect. Whatever appeared in the approved textbooks became the standard knowledge of educated people, while older geographical concepts that were excluded from the curricula simply ceased to be transmitted. Examination of late 19th century geography textbooks reveals a deliberate effort to eliminate older, imprecise terminology. Teachers' guides from the period explicitly instruct educators to correct students who use outdated geographical terms. A British teacher's manual from 1887 advises, if pupils refer to Tartary, they should be corrected and taught the proper names of the Central Asian regions. This pedagogical standardization meant that someone educated before 1870 might have learned about Tartaria as a schoolchild, while someone educated after 1890 almost certainly would not have encountered the term in their formal education. The last generation that remembered Tartaria, therefore, can be defined quite precisely in educational terms. Those who completed their schooling before geographical curricula were standardized and modernized, roughly between 1850 and 1880. By 1900, when these individuals were in their 50s and 60s, their geographical knowledge would have seemed quaint and outdated to younger generations. References to Tartaria would mark someone as educated in an earlier era, using geographical concepts that had been superseded. But there's another dimension to this generational memory that we haven't yet explored: the role of popular culture and adventure literature in shaping and preserving geographical imagination. The 19th century was the golden age of adventure fiction set in exotic locales. Authors like Jules Verne, Rudyard Kipling, and H. Rider Haggard fired readers' imaginations with tales of exploration and adventure in distant lands. These works both reflected and shaped popular geographical knowledge. Interestingly, even as Tartaria disappeared from atlases and textbooks, it lingered slightly longer in adventure fiction and popular literature. This was partly because adventure writers often drew on older geographical sources for inspiration, and partly because the vagueness of Tartaria was itself useful for fiction. A poorly defined region allowed greater authorial freedom than a precisely mapped one. But even in popular literature, the term faded rapidly. Analysis of adventure fiction published in English between 1850 and 1920 shows Tartary, or Tartaria, appearing in works published before 1890, but almost never in works published after 1900. The last notable exception is interesting. Tartary appears in several children's books and fairy tales published in the early 20th century. Often in the phrase, "the Khan of Tartary," as a stock figure representing exotic Eastern potentates. But these uses are clearly archaic even at the time. The term is being used precisely because of its old-fashioned, fairy tale quality, not because it refers to any real geographical knowledge. This suggests that by the early 20th century, Tartaria had completed its transformation from a genuine geographical term to a purely historical or fantastical reference, like Cathay or Byzantium, names that evoke a sense of the exotic and ancient but no longer correspond to contemporary political or geographical reality. We should also examine whether there were any communities or institutions that preserved the memory of Tartaria beyond the general cultural forgetting. Academic historians and historical geographers continue to use the term when discussing earlier periods of history. A historian writing about 18th century European knowledge of Asia might naturally refer to Tartaria when discussing how that region was understood at the time. But this is a specialized, scholarly use, a technical term for discussing the history of geographical knowledge, not a living geographical designation. Linguistic communities provide another interesting case. In some European languages, derivatives of Tatar or Tartar persisted in use longer than in English. French maintained Tartari in certain contexts into the early 20th century. Russian continued to use Tatarsky Tatar, but applied it to specific ethnic groups, primarily the Tatars of the Volga region and Crimea, rather than to Central Asia generally. But these linguistic survivals don't really represent a memory of Tartaria in the sense implied by our documentary's title. They're fragments of related terminology, not a preserved memory of the vast region that European maps once labeled Tartaria. There is one more category of people we should consider: the elderly travelers and explorers who had actually visited Central Asia in the mid-19th century and who lived into the early 20th century. Several British and Russian explorers and military officers who had traveled through Central Asia in the 1860s and 1870s published memoirs in the 1890s and early 1900s. Reading these memoirs reveals an interesting linguistic tension. The authors sometimes slip into using Tartary when describing their initial journey or their expectations before arrival, then switched to specific place names when describing their actual experiences. This pattern suggests that Tartary represented a kind of anticipatory geography, what one expected to find, while the specific names represented encountered reality. The memory of Tartaria, for these individuals, was less a memory of a place than a memory of a state of geographical ignorance that had been dispelled by their own exploration. One particularly revealing example comes from the memoirs of Captain Frederick Burnaby, a British cavalry officer who traveled through Russian Central Asia in 1875 and published his account, A Ride to Khiva, in 1876. In his introduction, Burnaby writes about his desire to explore the heart of Tartary, but in the body of the text, he never uses the term again, instead referring exclusively to specific cities, regions, and peoples. When these travelers and explorers died in the 1900s and 1910s, they took with them perhaps the last personal memories of Tartaria as something more than a map designation, as an imagined region that had shaped their expectations and motivated their journeys. But we must ask a more fundamental question. What exactly did this last generation remember when they remembered Tartaria? The historical record suggests they did not remember a unified civilization, a great empire, or a distinct culture. The encyclopedias they studied made clear that Tartaria was not a single political entity, but a collection of disparate peoples and territories. The maps they examined showed Tartaria divided into multiple regions with different characteristics. What they remembered, rather, was a particular way of organizing geographical knowledge, a framework that grouped together the vast, little-known interior of Asia under a single label, distinguishing it from the better-known peripheries, Russia, Persia, China, India. This framework reflected a specific epistemic condition, partial knowledge. Tartaria existed in European consciousness precisely to the extent that Europeans knew something about Central Asia, but not very much. It was a name for the space between ignorance and understanding. As that partial knowledge was replaced by more complete information, the framework became unnecessary. The name fell away not because the region disappeared or because memory of it was suppressed, but because it had never named anything except European unfamiliarity with the region. This interpretation is supported by examining how quickly and completely European geographical discourse shifted once detailed information became available. There was no gradual transition, no period of debate about whether to continue using Tartaria alongside more specific terms. Instead, cartographers and geographers simply stopped using the term as soon as they had better alternatives. The speed of this shift suggests that users of the term had always understood it as provisional, a placeholder that would naturally be replaced when better information emerged. But this raises a question about the nature of historical memory itself. If the last generation that remembered Tartaria remembered only a geographical convention, not a cultural or political reality, in what sense is this a meaningful memory at all? Consider what is lost and what is preserved when a geographical term passes out of use. When Tartaria disappeared from maps, no actual place disappeared. The steppes of Kazakhstan, the cities of Uzbekistan, the mountains of Kyrgyzstan all continued to exist, under names that better reflected how their inhabitants understood their own geography. What disappeared was a particular European perspective on this region, a way of seeing Central Asia as a unified, undifferentiated space characterized primarily by its distance from European civilization and its association with the medieval Mongol invasions that Europeans had called the Tartar invasions. The memory of Tartaria, then, is essentially the memory of a certain kind of geographical ignorance. The last generation that remembered it was the last generation for whom vast regions of the earth remained poorly understood, capable of being dismissed with vague, all-encompassing labels. From this perspective, the disappearance of Tartaria represents not a loss but a gain, a replacement of vague, Eurocentric generalizations with specific, more accurate knowledge of diverse peoples and places. But there's a countervailing consideration. While the specific term, Tartaria, was indeed just a European label with no indigenous basis, the various peoples and cultures it referred to did undergo dramatic transformations during the same period when the term was falling out of use. The Russian conquest of Central Asia brought profound changes. The suppression of local political autonomy, the restructuring of economic systems, the introduction of Russian administrative practices, and the beginning of cultural Russification that would intensify dramatically under Soviet rule. Many of the khanates and emirates that Tartaria had vaguely encompassed, Khiva, Bokhara, Kokand, lost their independence during precisely the period when their territories were being more precisely mapped and named by European cartographers. This coincidence of timing raises an uncomfortable question. Did the replacement of vague terms like Tartaria with specific, precise geographical knowledge actually facilitate colonial control? Is there a connection between knowing a place well enough to map it precisely and having the power to conquer it? The relationship between cartography and colonialism has been extensively studied by historians. Maps are never neutral representations. They reflect and reinforce power relationships. The same process of exploration and surveying that replaced Tartaria with specific place names also generated the intelligence necessary for military conquest and administrative control. Russian military cartography of Central Asia in the 1860s and 1870s exemplifies this connection. The detailed maps that enabled the Russian advance into Central Asia were the same maps that made terms like Tartaria obsolete by replacing vague regional designations with precise topographical and political information. British surveying in the region, conducted partly by the famous pundits, native explorers who traveled in disguise taking surreptitious measurements, similarly served both scientific and strategic purposes. From this perspective, the last generation that remembered Tartaria was also the last generation before Central Asia was fully incorporated into European imperial knowledge systems. Their memory of Tartaria, vague and imprecise as it was, represents a time when parts of the world remained outside the totalizing gaze of European cartographic science. Whether this should be regarded with nostalgia or as a necessary step in the development of more accurate geographical knowledge depends on one's perspective. We should also consider what happened to the term in the 20th century, after the generation that had learned it in their youth had passed away. For most of the 20th century, Tartaria was genuinely forgotten, not suppressed or hidden, simply forgotten because it had ceased to serve any useful purpose. Standard geographical education made no mention of it. Historical works discussing Central Asia use the specific names of khanates, emirates, and peoples, not the vague umbrella term. The Soviet reorganization of Central Asia into ethnically defined republics, the Kazakh SSR, the Uzbek SSR, the Kyrgyz SSR, the Turkmen SSR, and the Tajik SSR, further fragmented the region that 18th century maps had labeled Tartaria, making the old term even less relevant. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something unexpected happened. Tartaria began to be remembered again, though in a very different context. The rise of the Internet enabled people to access digitized historical maps and documents that had been largely forgotten. When contemporary viewers encountered 18th and 19th century maps showing Tartaria prominently labeled, many found it puzzling. Why had this apparently major region disappeared from modern maps? The absence of the term in contemporary geographical discourse, combined with its prominence on older maps, created the conditions for speculation. Some began to propose that Tartaria had been a great civilization whose existence had been deliberately erased from history. These theories, unconnected to serious historical scholarship, nonetheless gained traction in certain internet communities. This modern phenomenon is not the subject of our investigation, but it does illuminate something important about our title. The people proposing these theories are decidedly not the last generation that remembered Tartaria. They are discovering the term for the first time, without the context that would allow them to understand it as a provisional geographical label rather than a lost civilization. The actual last generation that remembered Tartaria understood it as nothing more than what it was, a European name for a poorly understood region. They watched it fade from use without alarm or nostalgia because they understood the process. Increasing geographical knowledge naturally replaced vague terms with precise ones. The contemporary rediscovery of the term, by people who lack this understanding, has paradoxically given Tartaria a kind of afterlife it never had an actual historical memory, transformed from a mundane cartographic convention into an object of mystery and speculation. Let us return, then, to our central question: who were the last generation that remembered Tartaria, and what did they remember? Based on the documentary evidence we've examined, we can construct a reasonably clear answer. The last generation that remembered Tartaria as an active geographical term were Europeans and Americans born between approximately 1820 and 1850, who received their education between 1830 and 1870, and who lived into the early 20th century. These individuals learned geography from textbooks and atlases that still used Tartary or Tartaria as a regional designation, even as that term was already beginning to be replaced by more specific nomenclature. What they remembered was not a lost civilization or a suppressed empire, but simply a way of categorizing Central Asian geography that had been standard in their youth, but became obsolete during their lifetimes. Many of them probably witnessed this change without giving it much thought. Geographical knowledge was improving. Old terms were being replaced with better ones. This was simply progress in understanding the world. Some members of this generation, particularly explorers, geographers, and military officers who had actually traveled to Central Asia, might have had more personal associations with the term, remembering their own earlier ignorance and the excitement of discovery when the reality of the region replaced their vague preconceptions. By the time these individuals died, mostly in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s, Tartaria had already been obsolete for decades. Their children had not learned the term in school. Their grandchildren had never heard it. The memory of Tartaria died a natural death, mourned by no one, because what had been forgotten was merely an outdated label, not a culture, not a people, not a civilization. Or so it seemed at the time. But the question that haunts any investigation of forgotten geographical terms is this: when we replace a vague term with more specific ones, do we gain only precision, or do we also lose something? Tartaria, for all its imprecision, represented a kind of perceptual unity, a recognition that the vast interior of Asia, despite its internal diversity, shared certain characteristics that distinguished it from the sedentary civilizations on its peripheries. The peoples of this region, however diverse, were linked by nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures, by Turkic and Mongolic languages, by particular adaptations to the steppe environment. When Tartaria was subdivided into precise administrative units and ethnic categories, this perception of unity was lost. the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and others came to be understood as separate peoples with separate histories, which they certainly were, but they were also part of a broader cultural world that had once been imperfectly captured by the term Tartaria. The Soviet and post-Soviet organization of Central Asia into separate national republics has reinforced this fragmented perception. Modern maps show Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan as distinct entities, which obscures the historical and cultural connections that link them. From this perspective, perhaps what the last generation that remembered Tartaria actually remembered was a different way of perceiving Central Asia, not as a collection of separate nations, but as a cultural continuum stretching across the steppes and deserts of the continental interior. If so, then the loss of this memory has consequences for how we understand Central Asian history and culture today. But we must be cautious about romanticizing the past or suggesting that vague, Eurocentric geographical labels represented some kind of superior wisdom. The term, Tartaria, was always an external imposition, never reflecting how the region's inhabitants understood their own geography and identity. The more precise geographical knowledge that replaced Tartaria has made possible a much more sophisticated understanding of Central Asian history, one that recognizes the diversity and complexity of the region rather than lumping it together under a single vague label. The last generation that remembered Tartaria was, in the end, simply the last generation whose geographical education predated this more sophisticated understanding. They remembered a word on a map. Behind that word lay a vast region of mountains and steppes, of cities and nomadic camps, of diverse peoples with their own histories and cultures. As knowledge of that region improved, the word became unnecessary. What was remembered, then, was not Tartaria itself, which had never existed as anything except a European naming convention, but a particular moment in the history of geographical knowledge, when Europeans knew enough about Central Asia to recognize it as a distinct region, but not enough to map it precisely. That moment passed. The last people who lived through it are long dead. And with them died the memory of Tartaria as anything more than a word that once appeared on maps. But here we encounter the paradox at the heart of our investigation. If Tartaria was merely a European geographical convention with no endogenous reality, why does its disappearance from maps and discourse occur with such striking completeness? Other European geographical terms of similar vintage, the Orient, the Levant, Persia, persist in cultural memory and occasional use even after being replaced by more precise alternatives. The near-total erasure of Tartaria from cultural memory between 1900 and 1990 suggests something more than the simple replacement of an imprecise term with better ones. It suggests an active process of forgetting, though perhaps not a deliberately organized one. Several factors may have contributed to this unusual completeness of forgetting. First, unlike Persia or Abyssinia, which corresponded at least roughly to actual political entities and endogenous names, Tartaria never had such correspondence. It was purely a European invention from the start, which made it easier to abandon completely once it ceased to be useful. Second, the region referred to as Tartaria came under the administrative control of the Russian Empire precisely during the period when the term was falling out of use. For European and American geographers, this meant the region was now definitively Russia's problem. Its internal organization and nomenclature would be determined by Russian authorities, who had never used Tartaria in the first place. Third, the rise of ethnographic and linguistic science in the late 19th century created a new framework for understanding Central Asia based on ethnic and linguistic classifications rather than broad geographical zones. This framework was fundamentally incompatible with the logic of Tartaria, which grouped together peoples of very different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds simply because they inhabited a vaguely defined geographical area. Fourth, the geopolitical tensions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Great Game between Britain and Russia, followed by the Russian Revolution and the formation of the Soviet Union, meant that Central Asia came to be understood primarily in terms of these great power conflicts rather than in terms of its own internal geography and history. These factors combined to create a situation where Tartaria not only ceased to be used but ceased to be remembered even as an obsolete term. It fell into a peculiar category of complete historical forgetting reserved for concepts that lose all relevance to contemporary concerns. The generation that remembered Tartaria, then, was the last generation for whom the term had any active meaning or reference. After they passed, there was simply no reason for anyone to remember it. Until now, the contemporary rediscovery of Tartaria through digitized historical maps has created a new situation, one where the term is known to many people but understood by very few. Most of those who encounter the word on 18th century maps lack the historical context to understand what it meant to the people who used it. This creates the conditions for misunderstanding and speculation. When people see Tartaria prominently labeled on old maps, but cannot find any explanation for the term in modern reference works, they naturally wonder why. The absence of the term in contemporary discourse, which is simply the result of it becoming obsolete, can appear suspicious to those unfamiliar with how geographical terminology evolves. In a sense, then, we might say that we are now living through a second generation that remembers Tartaria, but this is a fundamentally different kind of memory. The first generation remembered an active geographical term that they had learned in school and seen on contemporary maps. This second generation has rediscovered an obsolete term through historical research and is attempting to reconstruct its meaning without the benefit of continuous cultural transmission. The difference between these two kinds of remembering is crucial. The first generation's memory of Tartaria was embedded in a living context of geographical knowledge and practice. They understood how the term fit into the broader system of geographical nomenclature, why it was used, and why it was being replaced. The contemporary rediscovery of the term lacks this context. It is a recovery of the word without recovery of the understanding that originally accompanied it. This helps explain why contemporary discussions of Tartaria often veer into speculation and conspiracy theory. Without the contextual understanding that made the term meaningful to its original users, modern researchers must reconstruct that context from fragmentary evidence, a process that inevitably leads to some level of misunderstanding and overinterpretation. What, then, should we conclude about the last generation that remembered Tartaria? They were not the guardians of forbidden knowledge or the keepers of suppressed history. They were simply people whose education occurred during a transitional period in the history of geographical knowledge, after European exploration of Central Asia had begun in earnest, but before it had been completed and systematized. Their memory of Tartaria was mundane and unexceptional. It was simply one of many geographical terms they had learned, which they watched become obsolete as geographical knowledge improved. Most of them probably gave it no more thought than we give to other obsolete terms we learned in school that have since been replaced. If we could interview one of these individuals, say, a British gentleman born in 1840, educated in the 1850s, who lived until 1925, and ask him about Tartaria, he might well struggle to remember the term at all. If reminded of it, he might say something like, "Oh yes, Tartaria. That's what we called that region in Central Asia when I was a boy, before the Russian conquest." I believe we know the proper names for all those places now. Haven't thought of that old term in years. This hypothetical response captures what the historical evidence suggests. For the last generation that remembered Tartaria, the term represented nothing more mysterious or significant than an outdated piece of geographical nomenclature. The real historical puzzle, then, is not why Tartaria disappeared from maps. That is easily explained by the normal processes of improving geographical knowledge. The puzzle is why it disappeared so completely from cultural memory that its rediscovery a century later could seem mysterious and suggestive of hidden history. The answer to this puzzle may lie in understanding the nature of geographical knowledge itself. Geography, more than most fields of knowledge, is ruthlessly presentist. We care about the current names and boundaries of places, not their historical names, except when we're specifically studying history. When Tartaria ceased to be a current geographical term, it ceased to be transmitted through geography education. And because it had never been much more than a geographical term, unlike Rome or Persia, it had no deep literary or cultural associations. There was no other channel for its cultural transmission. This suggests that the completeness with which Tartaria was forgotten is actually a measure of how purely geographical and how culturally superficial the term always was. It disappeared completely precisely because it had never meant very much in the first place. If this interpretation is correct, then the title of our documentary, The Last Generation That Remembered Tartaria, contains within it a kind of irony. It suggests a dramatic narrative of fading memory and lost knowledge, but the historical reality is far more prosaic. The last generation that remembered Tartaria remembered only a word on a map, a word that had already become obsolete in their own lifetimes. When they died, taking that memory with them, nothing of significance was lost, because there had never been anything of significance to lose. And yet, there remains something poignant in the thought of this final generation, watching a familiar name vanish from the maps of their world, watching the geography of their youth become obsolete. Even if Tartaria was only a word, even if it represented only European ignorance rather than genuine knowledge, it was their word, part of the mental furniture of their world. Its disappearance marked their passage from youth to age, from a time when the world's geography was still being discovered to a time when it had been mapped and measured and divided among the great powers. In this sense, the last generation that remembered Tartaria stands for something larger than the specific term they remembered. They represent the last generation for whom large portions of the earth remain genuinely mysterious, capable of being imagined as well as known. After them came generations who inherited a fully mapped world, where every square mile had been surveyed and photographed, where no blank spaces on the map remained to fire the imagination. Perhaps that is what we really mean when we speak of the last generation that remembered Tartaria, not a specific memory of a specific term, but a memory of a different relationship to geographical knowledge, one where uncertainty and imagination still played a role, before the world had been completely reduced to measurements and coordinates. If so, then what was lost when Tartaria vanished from maps was not factual knowledge, but something more ineffable, a sense of the world as incompletely known, partially mysterious, still capable of surprise. The last generation that remembered Tartaria was the last generation that could look at a map and see, labeled in those vast interior spaces of Asia, a word that acknowledged how much remained unknown. When that generation passed, we gained precision. We gained accurate knowledge. We gained the ability to navigate and administer and exploit the Earth's resources with unprecedented efficiency. What we lost was the honest acknowledgement of our own ignorance, the intellectual humility embedded in terms like Tartaria, that said, in effect, Here is a vast region we do not yet fully understand. Whether the trade was worth it, precision for humility, knowledge for mystery, is a question each generation must answer for itself. But the trade has been made. The last generation that remembered Tartaria is gone. And with them has gone that particular moment in human history when the interior of Asia was still, for Europeans at least, a space of possibility and imagination rather than known fact. What remains is the historical record, the maps that once showed Tartaria, the encyclopedias that once described it, the memories of travelers who once journeyed there expecting to find one thing and found another. And the question our documentary has attempted to answer: who remembered, what did they remember, and why did that memory fade? The answer, as we have seen, is simpler and more complex than the question might suggest. Simple in that the memory was merely of a geographical term that became obsolete. Complex in that this simple forgetting reflects profound changes in how humans understand and relate to the geography of their world. The last generation that remembered Tartaria witnessed and participated in the transformation of geography from a field that acknowledged vast uncertainties to one that claimed comprehensive knowledge. They saw Tartaria disappear from maps not because it was suppressed, but because it was superseded. And in witnessing this transformation, they witnessed something both ordinary and extraordinary: the ordinary process by which human knowledge grows and old terms become obsolete, and the extraordinary moment when the last blank spaces on the map were filled in, when the world became, for the first time in human history, completely known. Or so we believed.